The morning light filtered through paper screens, casting soft squares on the tatami floor of Takeo Matsumoto's apartment. At 97, Takeo moved with the careful precision that had become second nature over the years. He folded his futon with practiced hands, smoothing out wrinkles with palms that once moved with dramatic flourish across stages throughout Japan. His morning routine never changed. Green tea prepared at exactly 70 degrees, hot enough to release the flavor but not so hot it turned bitter. Toast with a thin layer of butter and homemade plum jam his neighbor brought every spring. A small bowl of miso soup with bits of tofu and seaweed. Takeo sat at his low table, knees complaining as he lowered himself to the cushion. From his window he could see the curved roof of a temple, its blue tiles catching sunlight. 6 decades ago he would have been awake for hours already, practicing voice exercises before dawn, preparing for rehearsals that would stretch until evening. Another day, he said to no one. His voice, once powerful enough to reach the back row of the Minami-za Theater without amplification, now barely filled his small kitchen. The apartment walls held memories. Photographs in simple wooden frames showed a younger Takeo in elaborate costumes, face painted white with dramatic red and black lines, striking powerful poses on stage. In one he held a fan with deadly seriousness. In another, a wooden sword raised above his head captured mid-battle. The most prominent photo showed him in his most famous role as the tragic lover Tokubei in The Love Suicides at Sonozaki. Critics had called his performance transcendent and heart-wrenching. That had been his final role. 2 weeks after that photograph was taken, Takeo's father suffered a stroke. As the only son, Takeo left the theater to run the family business, a small but respected shop selling traditional paper goods. He'd meant to return to acting eventually. A year turned into 5, then 10. His father recovered partially but needed constant care. By the time his parents passed away, Takeo had 2 children of his own, a mortgage, responsibilities. The theater became a dream from another life. The mail slot clicked. Takeo listened to the soft thump of letters hitting the floor. Bills, probably. Maybe a flyer for the new supermarket or another pamphlet about services for the elderly. He wasn't in a hurry. The mail would still be there after he finished his tea. His daughter Yumiko called every Sunday and Wednesday at precisely 10 o'clock. She worried too much. "Are you eating properly, Father? Are you taking your walks? Did you go to your checkup?" Takeo answered patiently each time, assuring her he wasn't quite ready to fall apart just yet. His health was surprisingly good for someone knocking on the door of a century. His doctor had said his heart was strong, his mind sharp. Good genes, the doctor had told him. "And what was your profession before retiring?" "I was an actor," Takeo had said. "Before that, I sold paper." "Ah, the paper business kept you on your feet, I imagine." Takeo hadn't corrected him. Few people remembered the brief but bright moment when Takeo Matsumoto had been a rising star in traditional kabuki theater. Sometimes Takeo himself wondered if he had imagined it. After washing his breakfast dishes, Takeo made his way to the front door to collect the mail. 3 envelopes lay on the floor. A utilities bill, a health insurance notice, and something different. Cream-colored paper, heavy stock with an embossed logo in the corner. The logo of the Kyoto Traditional Arts Foundation. Takeo's hands weren't as steady as they once were. He fumbled slightly opening the envelope, careful not to tear what looked like an important document. Inside was a letter, typed on the same cream-colored paper, with a handwritten signature at the bottom. He read it once quickly, then again slowly, making sure he understood correctly. The foundation was organizing a special performance celebrating the golden age of post-war kabuki. A retrospective showcasing the period when Takeo had performed. The director, Hiroshi Tanaka, was the son of one of Takeo's old theater colleagues. The letter mentioned having discovered archival footage of Takeo's performances. "Your interpretation of Tokubei in The Love Suicides at Sonozaki remains a masterclass in emotional depth," the letter read. Then came the invitation that made Takeo's heart skip. Would he consider making an appearance? Not a full performance, they understood his age, but perhaps a recitation of the famous monologue from his final role. A living connection to a bygone era of theater. Takeo lowered himself to the step in his entryway, letter trembling in his hand. 60 years. 60 years since he had stood under those lights, felt the weight of a costume worn the traditional makeup. 60 years since he had spoken those lines that once lived in his very bones. Could he even remember them? He closed his eyes and tentatively began to recite. How cruel is the world of men. The words came back one after another, rising from some deep well of memory. His voice grew stronger as he continued, body straightening as if pulled by invisible strings. His hand moved in a gesture so ingrained it had survived decades of disuse. Then he stopped, suddenly aware of how foolish he must look. An old man sitting in his entryway, talking to himself, moving his hands in strange patterns. His knees ached. His back complained from sitting on the hard step. Ridiculous, he murmured, carefully refolding the letter and placing it on the small table where he kept his keys. At my age, he went about his day as usual. A slow walk to the nearby park, where he sat watching children play while eating a rice ball he'd prepared that morning. A stop at the small grocery store for tomorrow's food. An afternoon nap. Television news at 5 o'clock, but his eyes kept drifting to the letter. After dinner, he pulled out an old photo album he rarely opened. The binding cracked as he turned pages yellowed with age. Theater programs, newspaper clippings, notes from directors, a pressed flower from an admirer. One review stood out, its paper thin and fragile. Matsumoto doesn't merely perform the role of Tokubei, he inhabits it completely. When he speaks of impossible love and the cruelty of social boundaries, we believe every word. His final monologue left this hardened critic in tears. Takeo closed the album. He walked to his telephone, an old model with large buttons for his failing eyesight. The letter included a phone number. His finger hovered over the keypad. What would Yumiko say? She would worry about his health, the stress, the exertion. Perhaps she would be right to worry. He didn't call that night. Or the next morning. 3 days passed, the letter sitting untouched on his table, though his eyes went to it countless times. On the third night, he dreamed of the theater. The smell of wood and incense, the murmur of the audience before curtain rise, the transformative power of becoming someone else entirely. He woke before dawn, made tea, and watched the sun rise over Kyoto's ancient rooftops. As the city slowly came to life around him, Takeo made his decision. With careful movements, he picked up the phone and dialed the number from the letter. After 3 rings, a young woman's voice answered, Kyoto Traditional Arts Foundation. This is Matsumoto Takeo, he said, his voice steadier than it had been in years. Regarding the letter about the Kabuki retrospective. Oh, Matsumoto-san. Yes, Director Tanaka will be so pleased. May I tell him you're calling about the invitation? Takeo took a deep breath. The smell of grease paint and wooden stage boards seemed to fill his senses, a ghost of memory so powerful it was almost physical. Yes, he said finally. Tell him I would be honored to perform. As he set the phone down, a strange feeling washed over him, fear and excitement in equal measure, like standing in the wings waiting for a cue. He looked at his hands, spotted with age but still expressive, still capable. After 60 years, Takeo Matsumoto was going back to the stage. Yumiko arrived 3 days after Takeo made his phone call to the theater. She hadn't planned to visit until next month, but something in her father's voice during their regular call had concerned her. He'd mentioned the invitation casually, as if agreeing to perform on stage at 97 years old was no different from accepting an offer of afternoon tea. Father, are you sure about this? She asked. Setting down her overnight bag in the small guest room, sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the silver in her hair. At 65, Yumiko had recently retired herself from teaching elementary school. It's been so long. Takeo sat across from her at the low table, back straight despite his years. Perhaps that is precisely why I must do it, he replied, pouring tea with steady hands. Before it becomes forever too late. Yumiko studied her father. She had only the faintest childhood memories of him as an actor, mostly impressions of elaborate costumes and makeup that had frightened her as a small child. By the time she was old enough to appreciate his talent, he had already left the stage behind. What exactly will you perform? She asked. The final monologue from The Love Suicides at Sonozaki. My last role. His eyes took on a distant quality. 4 minutes on stage. That's all they've asked of me. 4 minutes that require months of preparation for professionals half your age, Yumiko pointed out. Takeo smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. I'm not starting from nothing. Some things once learned, never truly leave the body. That evening, as if to prove his point, Takeo cleared the small space in his living room. He stood in the center, closed his eyes, and began to recite the famous monologue. His voice, initially wavering, grew stronger with each line. His hands, gnarled with arthritis, moved in the precise, stylized gestures of traditional kabuki. Yumiko watched, transfixed. She had never seen this version of her father, not in her living memory. The stooped old man seemed to grow taller, his movements becoming fluid and purposeful. When he finished, the silence in the apartment felt charged with something she couldn't name. "That was," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Rusty," Takeo said, lowering himself carefully onto a cushion. "Very rusty, but still there underneath the years." The next morning brought a visitor. Naoki Yamada, a young assistant director from the theater, arrived carrying a script and a recording device. Barely 30, with fashionable glasses and a respectful manner, he bowed deeply to Takeo. "It's an honor, Matsumoto-san," he said, his voice conveying genuine reverence. "Director Tanaka sends his regards. He would have come himself, but he's overseeing rehearsals for the main production." Takeo invited the young man in, and they sat around the table while Yumiko prepared fresh tea. Naoki explained that he would be coming 3 times a week to help Takeo prepare for his performance. "I've studied the archival footage of your original performance," Naoki said, his enthusiasm evident. "The techniques you used, they're not taught the same way anymore. That's what makes this retrospective so important." They began that very day. Naoki set up his recording device to capture Takeo's practice, explaining that Director Tanaka wanted to review the progress. They started with voice exercises, controlling breath, projecting without straining, finding the right pitch and resonance. Takeo's voice cracked on the higher notes. He frowned, frustrated with himself. "When I was young, I could sustain a note for 45 seconds without taking a breath," he said. Naoki nodded encouragingly. "We'll work within your current abilities, Matsumoto-san. The emotion and technique are what matter most." By the end of the 2-hour session, Takeo was exhausted but satisfied. They had focused solely on the opening lines of the monologue, repeating them again and again until the delivery felt natural. "Same time on Wednesday?" Naoki asked as he packed up his equipment. Takeo nodded. "I'll practice in between," and practice he did. After Naoki left, he established a new daily routine. Mornings were for physical preparation, gentle stretches to improve his flexibility, breathing exercises to strengthen his lungs. Afternoons were dedicated to memorization and vocal practice. Yumiko stayed for a week, longer than she had planned. She watched with a mixture of concern and amazement as her father transformed their daily walks into opportunities for training. He would stop suddenly to practice a particular gesture or quietly recite lines under his breath as they rested on park benches. "You're taking this very seriously?" she observed one evening, as she massaged an ointment into his aching shoulders. "It will be my last performance," Takeo said simply. "I want to give them something worth remembering." After Yumiko returned to Tokyo, promising to come back for the actual performance, Takeo's apartment became his personal rehearsal studio. He pushed furniture against walls to create more space. He practiced in front of mirrors. He recorded himself on an old cassette player and listened critically to his delivery. The visits from Naoki became the highlight of his week. The young man brought news from the theater, updates on the larger production, and most importantly, guidance that connected Takeo to the world he had left behind 60 years ago. During their 4th session, Naoki brought a surprise, a tablet computer loaded with rare footage of kabuki performances from the 1950s and 60s. "I thought you might like to see some of your contemporaries," he explained, helping Takeo navigate the unfamiliar technology. They spent an hour watching clips of performers long gone. Many had been Takeo's friends and rivals. He pointed out certain actors to Naoki, sharing stories that made the young man laugh or nod thoughtfully. This one, Kenji Shimada, he once forgot his lines in the middle of a crucial scene, Takeo recalled, pointing to a dignified actor on the screen. Instead of panicking, he improvised a completely new monologue, still in character. The critics praised him for bringing fresh perspective to a classic role. He never admitted it was a mistake. Near the end of the 2nd week, Director Tanaka himself came to observe a practice session. A serious man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair, He watched intently as Takeo performed the complete monologue. When Takeo finished, the director was silent for a long moment. "When I was a boy," Tanaka finally said, "my father took me to see your last performance. I was too young to appreciate it fully, but I never forgot how the audience fell completely silent when you spoke these lines." He bowed deeply to Takeo. "You honor us by returning to the stage, Matsumoto-san." As the performance date drew closer, practical concerns arose. A costume needed to be fitted. The traditional makeup, white base with dramatic lines to emphasize expressions, would need to be applied by a professional. There would be a technical rehearsal on the stage itself. "We've simplified the lighting for your segment," Naoki explained during their 8th session. "Just a warm spotlight. No complex cues or changes." Takeo nodded, grateful for the consideration but somewhat embarrassed by the special treatment. "I'm not made of glass," he protested mildly. "Of course not," Naoki replied with a smile. "But even our youngest performers get overwhelmed by technical elements. We want you to focus entirely on your performance." 1 month into preparation, Takeo faced his first real challenge. A lingering cold left him hoarse, unable to practice properly for nearly a week. He sipped honey and ginger tea constantly, worried that his voice wouldn't recover in time. Yumiko called daily during this setback, her concern evident even over the phone. "Perhaps this is too much strain," she suggested carefully. "It's just a cold," Takeo insisted. "Everyone gets colds." But alone in his apartment, he confronted his fears. What if his voice failed him on stage? What if his memory slipped at the crucial moment? What if his body simply couldn't match his intentions anymore? On the 3rd day of his illness, unable to sleep and frustrated by his weakness, Takeo pulled out an old wooden box from the back of his closet. Inside were mementos he rarely examined: theater programs, handwritten notes from directors, a small folding fan he had used in performances. At the bottom of the box lay a faded photograph he had almost forgotten. It showed him with the full cast of The Love Suicides at Sonozaki after opening night. Everyone was smiling, still in costume but with makeup partially removed. Takeo's arm was draped around the shoulders of the actress who had played his lover. He remembered that night clearly. The exhilaration, the sense of having created something meaningful, the camaraderie of the company. They had all gone out for drinks afterward, celebrating until dawn. Takeo placed the photograph on his small altar next to the pictures of his late wife and parents. "Watch over me," he whispered to all of them. "I'm going to need a little help with this one." By the following week, his voice had recovered. The rehearsals intensified. 2 weeks before the performance, Naoki brought news that tickets for the retrospective had sold out completely. "There's been a lot of interest since word got out about your participation," he explained. "Several critics and theater historians plan to attend." Takeo felt a flutter of nervousness at this information. He had been thinking of his performance as a personal journey, a private reconnection with his past. The reality of an audience, of expectations and judgments, suddenly seemed overwhelming. That night he dreamed he was standing on stage, but when he opened his mouth to speak, no sound emerged. He woke in a cold sweat, heart racing. But the next morning, as sunlight filled his small apartment, he returned to his practice with renewed determination. Voice exercises first, then physical warm-ups, then the monologue itself, over and over until it flowed naturally again. "I've come too far to back out now," he told his reflection in the mirror. One last performance, one last time on stage. With just 10 days remaining before the performance, Takeo was ready to visit the theater itself for the first time in 60 years. The Minami-za Theater stood in downtown Kyoto, its traditional architecture a stark contrast to the modern buildings surrounding it. Takeo gazed up at the familiar curved roof and wooden facade from the backseat of Naoki's car. His heart beat faster as memories flooded back, arriving early for rehearsals, leaving late after performances, standing outside with fellow actors discussing the night's show. "Are you ready, Matsumoto-san?" Naoki asked gently. Takeo nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The young man helped him from the car, then guided him toward the rear entrance, the artist's entrance as it had always been called. The smell hit him first. Wood polished by decades of use, dust and incense, paint and fabric. It was the scent of his youth, somehow unchanged despite the renovations he knew the theater had undergone. Takeo closed his eyes briefly, drinking it in. "We've arranged a small dressing room for you," Naoki said, leading him down a corridor lined with photographs of famous performances. Takeo spotted several faces he recognized, actors he had worked with, some who had become nationally famous while he sold paper and raised children. He paused at one particular photograph, a production of Yoshitsune and the Thousand Cherry Trees from 1961. If things had been different, he might have played the lead in that very production. The actor who did Haro Tanaka had been Director Tanaka's father and one of Takeo's closest friends at the theater. "My father treasured your friendship," said a voice behind them. Director Tanaka himself approached, bowing respectfully. "He often said he learned more from watching you rehearse than from any formal training." Takeo bowed in return, touched by the words. "Your father was a gifted performer." "I was fortunate to know him," the director smiled. "He would be pleased to see you here again. Now shall we show you where you'll be performing?" They continued down the corridor and through a set of heavy doors that Takeo remembered well. Then they were backstage, a space both familiar and changed. Modern lighting equipment hung alongside traditional set pieces. Young stagehands moved about purposefully, preparing for that evening's regular performance. And then Takeo saw it, the stage itself. Gleaming wooden boards polished to a soft glow, the hanamichi, the raised platform extending into the audience where he had made so many dramatic entrances and exits, the red and black curtain currently raised. "We've scheduled 20 minutes for you to get comfortable with the space," Director Tanaka explained. "No pressure to perform yet, just to reacquaint yourself." Takeo nodded, his eyes never leaving the stage. With Naoki close by in case he needed support, he slowly made his way to the edge of the performance area. He hesitated just a moment before taking the small step up. Standing on the boards again after 60 years felt like coming home. The stage creaked slightly beneath his feet, a sound so comforting and familiar that Takeo had to close his eyes again. He took a few careful steps forward, his body remembering the way to the center spot marked by a nearly invisible nail head. The theater was empty, except for a few staff members, but Takeo could feel the ghost of audiences past watching him. How many thousands of people had he performed for in this space? How many emotions had he portrayed? How many characters inhabited? "The acoustics haven't changed," Director Tanaka called from the side. "Would you like to test your voice?" Takeo cleared his throat and projected a single line from his monologue, the opening words that set the tragic tone. "How cruel is the world of men that separates those who love." His voice carried perfectly to the back of the theater, just as it had decades ago. A young stagehand who had been adjusting a light stopped to listen, his face showing surprise at the power coming from the elderly man. "Beautiful," the director said softly. "Now would you like to try the blocking we discussed?" For the next 15 minutes, Takeo worked with Naoki and the director to plan his movements during the performance. They kept it simple. Center stage for the beginning, a few steps to stage right during the emotional climax, then back to center for the conclusion. No complicated movements, nothing that might tax his balance or strength. "Less is more with this piece," Director Tanaka assured him. "Your voice and expressions will carry the performance." As they finished discussing the staging, other performers began arriving for the evening show. Young actors and actresses who would perform a contemporary take on a classic play. Word had spread quickly that Takeo Matsumoto was in the building. Several performers stopped to introduce themselves, some bowing with the deep respect reserved for revered teachers. A middle-aged actor approached last, introducing himself as Koji Watanabe, the lead in the current production. "Matsumoto-san, it's an honor," he said, bowing deeply. "I studied recordings of your performances at university. Your tokubei influenced my approach to every tragic role I've played." Takeo was moved by the man's sincerity. "You are too kind. I look forward to seeing your performance someday." "Please," Koji said. "I'd be honored if you would watch tonight. We perform at 7. Perhaps you could observe from the director's box." Director Tanaka nodded encouragingly. "An excellent idea. It would help you reacclimate to the theater environment as an observer before performing yourself." Takeo hesitated. He had planned to return to his apartment, to rest and practice more. But the pull of the theater, now that he was back inside it, was irresistible. "I would be delighted," he said finally. After exploring the backstage area further, meeting the costume designer who would adjust his performance attire, and confirming the schedule for his technical rehearsal the following week. Takeo was shown to a small room where he could rest before the evening performance. The dressing room was modest but comfortable, with a sofa, a small table with tea-making supplies, and a mirror surrounded by lights. Naoki helped prepare some green tea, then excused himself to attend to other duties, promising to return before the show. Alone for the first time since entering the theater, Takeo sat quietly, sipping his tea and absorbing the reality of where he was. The walls of the room were covered with photographs of past productions, a visual history of the Minami-za spanning decades. His eye caught a small black and white image in the corner, himself as a young performer, captured mid-gesture in a role he barely remembered playing. Someone had placed it there recently. A welcome-back gift, perhaps. The hours passed quickly. Takeo dozed briefly on the sofa, then refreshed himself with more tea. Naoki returned as promised, bringing a light meal of rice balls and miso soup. They ate together while the sounds of the theater preparing for a performance filtered through the walls. Distant voices calling cues, the tuning of traditional instruments, the gradual hum of an audience gathering. It sounds exactly the same, Takeo said wonderingly. After all these years, Naoki smiled. Some things in theater never change. When it was time, director Tanaka personally escorted Takeo to the private box overlooking the stage. It was the best view in the house, traditionally reserved for distinguished guests. My father sat here when he could no longer perform, the director explained as he helped Takeo to a comfortable chair. He said watching from this angle gave him new insights into plays he thought he knew by heart. The lights dimmed. The murmur of the audience faded to expectant silence. Takeo leaned forward slightly, hands resting on his knees, as the curtain rose on a world he had once belonged to completely. The performance was excellent, a traditional story reimagined with subtle contemporary touches. Koji Watanabe was indeed a fine actor, his movements precise, his emotional delivery convincing. Takeo found himself fully absorbed, the decades falling away as he lost himself in the familiar rhythms of kabuki storytelling. During intermission, director Tanaka brought tea. "What do you think?" he asked. "They are very good," Takeo said honestly. "Different from my time, but the heart is the same." "Theater evolves, but its essence remains," the director agreed. "That's why your performance in our retrospective is so important. You're a living bridge to techniques and approaches that would otherwise exist only in recordings." The second half of the show was even stronger than the first. When the final curtain fell, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Takeo joined in, clapping until his palms stung. As the crowd dispersed and the actors began their post-performance routines, director Tanaka suggested they go backstage to congratulate the company. Takeo agreed, curious to see how modern performers wound down after a show. The backstage area was buzzing with energy. Makeup was being removed. Costume pieces hung carefully on racks. Props returned to their proper places. Several performers were gathered in a small break room, laughing and critiquing moments from the show. When Takeo entered with the director, the room fell silent. Koji, still in partial makeup, stood and bowed. "Matsumoto-san, you honor us. What did you think of our humble performance?" All eyes turned to Takeo. These young people, he realized, valued his opinion not just out of respect for his age, but as a link to a theatrical tradition they were still part of. His words mattered to them professionally. "I was moved," he said simply. "Your technique is excellent, and more importantly, I believed in the emotions you portrayed. The scene where the brothers confront each other," he gestured with his hands to illustrate a particular moment. The tension was perfect. The actors' faces lit up at his specific praise. Soon Takeo found himself seated in their midst, drawn into a discussion of performance techniques, character motivations, and the challenges of keeping traditional theater relevant for modern audiences. One young actress asked him about his preparation process from the old days. "We rehearsed from dawn until dusk," Takeo recalled. "No recordings to study then. We learned by watching our seniors repeating movements until they became second nature. My teacher would hit my ankle with a bamboo stick if my foot position was wrong." He chuckled. "Different times, but effective," Koji said. "The precision from that era is hard to match." As the evening wore on, Takeo felt a curious blend of past and present. Here he was, discussing theater with professional actors again, something he had never expected to experience again in this lifetime. Yet he was also acutely aware of the years between, the life he had lived away from this world. When he finally left the theater that night, supported by Naoki's steady arm, Takeo felt both exhausted and invigorated. The visit had confirmed what he already knew in his heart. He belonged on that stage one last time. Whatever fears or doubts had lingered were gone now, replaced by a calm determination. 1 week until the technical rehearsal, Naoki reminded him, as they drove back to his apartment. "Are you feeling prepared, Matsumoto-san?" Takeo gazed out the window at the nighttime streets of Kyoto, so changed from his youth yet still somehow the same city. "Yes," he said softly. "I think I am." The final week before the performance passed in a blur of activity. Takeo's small apartment became a hub of visitors. Naoki coming daily for rehearsals, the costume designer bringing fabric samples and taking measurements, even director Tanaka stopping by twice to check on his progress. "The advance press coverage has been extraordinary," the director told him during one visit, showing Takeo a newspaper article about the upcoming retrospective. "Your participation has generated significant interest. We've had to turn away several television crews who wanted to film rehearsals." Takeo was grateful for that protection. The thought of cameras recording his practice sessions, capturing his mistakes and hesitations, would have added unbearable pressure. 3 days before the performance, Yumiko arrived from Tokyo with her husband and 2 adult children. They had booked rooms at a nearby hotel, insisting that Takeo maintain his routine without house guests to worry about. "You look different, father," Yumiko said when she first saw him. "Younger somehow," Takeo laughed. "Flattery won't make me less nervous. I'm serious," she insisted. "There's something changed in your posture, your eyes." She studied him. "You look like you have purpose again." Her words stayed with him that night as he practiced in front of his mirror one last time. Had he been merely existing these past years? The daily routines, the quiet pleasures of his books and walks had seemed enough. Yet now, with the performance approaching, he felt more fully alive than he had in decades. The technical rehearsal was scheduled for the day before the actual performance. Takeo arrived at the theater that morning with both excitement and trepidation. This would be the first time he would wear the costume and full makeup, the first complete run-through with lighting and sound. The costume department had created a simplified version of the traditional kabuki attire he would have worn 60 years ago. The heavy silk robes were authentic, but with hidden modifications, magnetic closures instead of complicated ties, lighter weight fabric in some layers, subtle adjustments to allow greater freedom of movement for his aged body. "We preserved the appearance while making it more comfortable," explained Hana, the head costume designer. "No one in the audience will notice the difference." Putting on the layers felt like stepping back in time. Each piece had its proper order, its specific way of folding and tying. Hana helped him dress, her experienced hands moving efficiently. "My grandmother was a dresser here in the 1960s, she told him as she worked. "She might have helped you back then." "Mizuki-san?" Takeo asked, remembering a tiny, fierce woman who ran the costume department with military precision. Hana's eyes widened. "Yes, that was her. She would talk about the golden days of the theater until she passed away." She smiled warmly. "She would be honored to know I'm dressing you today." Next came the makeup. A young man named Toshiro had been assigned as Takeo's makeup artist. He approached the task with reverent concentration, explaining each step as he worked. "We'll use a slightly different technique than the traditional method," he said, applying a base layer to Takeo's face. "The stage lighting has changed and modern makeup photographs differently." He paused. "But the essence remains true to tradition." Takeo sat perfectly still as layer after layer transformed his face. The white base that erased his age spots and wrinkles, the red lines around the eyes that emphasized emotion, the subtle shading that would make his expressions visible from the back row. When Toshiro finally held up a mirror, Takeo barely recognized himself. The face looking back at him was neither his current elderly self, nor the young man he had once been, but something in between, a theatrical mask that contained elements of both. "Remarkable," he whispered. "The transformation is always powerful," Toshiro said softly, "even for actors who perform regularly." Fully costumed and made up, Takeo made his way to the stage for the technical run-through. Director Tanaka waited there with Naoki and several stagehands. When Takeo appeared, the director's face broke into a wide smile. "Perfect," he said. "Absolutely perfect." They began the rehearsal. The lighting technicians adjusted the spotlight's intensity and angle as Takeo moved through his blocking. The sound engineer tested the acoustics, making sure his voice would carry properly without amplification. A photographer documented the process discreetly from the side. After 2 complete run-throughs, Director Tanaka called for a break. "How are you feeling, Matsumoto-san? Not too tired?" Takeo considered the question honestly. His knees ached from standing and his throat felt slightly strained. But the energy flowing through him was undeniable. "I can continue," he said. "One more run-through then," the director decided. "Save your strength for tomorrow." The final rehearsal went smoothly. Takeo delivered the monologue with growing confidence, his voice finding the emotional nuances he had worked so hard to recapture. When he finished, the small group of theater staff watching from the house broke into spontaneous applause. "That wasn't just good," Director Tanaka said as he helped Takeo down the small step at the edge of the stage. "That was extraordinary." Back in the dressing room, as Toshiro carefully removed the elaborate makeup, Takeo felt a curious sense of calm descend. The nerves and anxiety that had plagued him intermittently over the past week seemed to have evaporated. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had already proven to himself that he could do this. Naoki drove him home, chatting about final arrangements for the next day. "A car will pick you up at 4 o'clock, he explained. "The retrospective begins at 7, but you'll need time for makeup and final preparations. Your segment is scheduled for approximately 8:15. "And my family?" Takeo asked. "Front row, center section," Naoki assured him. "The best seats in the house." That night, Takeo slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No anxiety dreams, no waking up to practice lines in the dark, just peaceful rest. The morning of the performance dawned bright and clear. Takeo rose with the sun, performed his usual stretches, and prepared a simple breakfast. Yumiko had offered to come by early, but he had declined. These quiet hours alone were necessary, a time to center himself before the evening's challenge. He spent the morning in gentle preparation, voice exercises, breathing techniques, a slow walk in the nearby garden. In the afternoon, he napped briefly, then bathed and dressed in comfortable clothes for the journey to the theater. At precisely 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The car had arrived. The theater was a hive of activity when he arrived. The retrospective was a major cultural event, featuring recordings and live performances highlighting the evolution of kabuki over the decades. Famous critics, theater historians, and even a few government officials were expected in the audience. Takeo was led directly to his dressing room, where Toshiro waited to begin the transformation once again. This time, knowing what to expect, Takeo surrendered himself completely to the process. As the makeup artist worked, a gentle knock came at the door. Director Tanaka entered, accompanied by an elderly woman leaning on a cane. "Forgive the interruption," he said, "but there's someone who very much wanted to meet you before the performance." The woman stepped forward, her face breaking into a smile that made her eyes nearly disappear into deep wrinkles. "Matsumoto-san," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "You won't remember me. I was just a junior actress when you left the theater. Yukiko Nakamura. I played the servant girl in your final production." Takeo stared at her, memories rushing back. "With the blue kimono," he said slowly. "You had a scene where you dropped a teacup." Her face lit up with delight. "Yes, you remember. I was so nervous performing with you. You were already famous and I was nobody." "You had natural talent," Takeo said honestly. "I told the director so at the time." Tears welled in her eyes. "I went on to have a good career. Not spectacular, but satisfying. And now my granddaughter is studying traditional dance." She bowed as deeply as her aged body would allow. "When I heard you were performing again, I had to come. To complete the circle." The encounter left Takeo deeply moved, as Toshiro resumed his work, applying the final touches to his makeup. Takeo felt a sense of connection not just to his own past, but to the unbroken line of theatrical tradition that stretched behind and before him. The final hour before the performance passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. Naoki brought reports from the house. The audience was arriving, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. The other performers in the retrospective, professional actors recreating famous scenes from different eras, stopped by to wish him well. Koji Watanabe, who had befriended him during his previous visit, came last. "The house is full," he reported, "and rumors of your performance have reached beyond theater circles. There are film directors out there, television producers." He smiled encouragingly. "But don't think about that. Just do what you've prepared to do." At 8:05, Takeo stood in the wings, fully costumed, fully made up, listening to the current segment of the retrospective taking place on stage. Director Tanaka stood beside him, a reassuring presence. "Your family is in place," the director murmured. "Your daughter looks very proud already." Takeo nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet. He was saving his voice, conserving energy. But more than that, he was absorbing the moment, the culmination of months of preparation, decades of waiting, a lifetime of experience. A stagehand approached with a cup of warm water with honey. "For your throat, Matsumoto-san," he said respectfully. Takeo sipped the soothing liquid, handed back the cup, and straightened his posture. On stage, the current scene was drawing to a close. Soon it would be his turn. "Ready?" Director Tanaka asked softly. Takeo took a deep breath, feeling the costume settle around him, the makeup tightening slightly on his face as he composed his features into the serene mask of his character. "I've been ready for 60 years, he replied. The audience applauded as the previous performers left the stage. A momentary darkness fell as stagehands quickly reset for Takeo's segment. Then Director Tanaka squeezed his shoulder gently, the signal. Takeo stepped forward, ready to cross the threshold between wings and stage, between past and present, between the life he had lived and the life he had left behind. It was time. Takeo stepped onto the stage. The spotlight found him immediately, a warm glow that both illuminated and isolated him in the vastness of the theater. The audience, which had been murmuring quietly during the transition, fell completely silent. He stood perfectly still, allowing them to see him fully, the costume, the makeup, the dignified figure he cut despite his 97 years. In kabuki tradition, this moment of stillness before beginning was crucial, establishing the character's presence and drawing the audience into the world of the story. From his position center stage, Takeo could make out the front rows. There was Yumiko, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, his son-in-law and grandchildren, their faces upturned with anticipation and something like wonder. Behind them, a sea of strangers who had come to witness this unusual return. Takeo took a breath that filled his lungs completely. He found the spot at the back of the theater that Naoki had advised him to focus on, a small decorative Mon crest above the exit door. Then he began. How cruel is the world of men that separates those who love. His voice emerged stronger than he had dared hope, carrying to every corner of the hushed space. The social order that keeps apart hearts that beat as one is more heartless than winter snow. The familiar words flowed through him. His hands moved in the precise, stylized gestures that communicated as much as the text itself. Grief, longing, desperation. Each movement felt both newly discovered and deeply remembered, as if his body had been storing these motions for 60 years, waiting for this moment to release them. As he reached the emotional peak of the monologue, Takeo took the 3 steps to stage right that they had choreographed. His left knee twinged slightly, but he incorporated the momentary stiffness into his character's movement. A man weighted down by impossible choices. If we cannot live together in this life, then perhaps the next world will show more mercy. He lowered his voice, making the audience lean forward to catch his words. The river awaits. Its cold embrace promises an end to suffering. In the original play, this monologue came just before the tragic double suicide of the lovers. Takeo let the full weight of that impending doom color his delivery. His right hand trembled slightly as he extended it toward an imaginary lover, not from age, but from the emotion flowing through him. The final lines approached. Takeo centered himself again, gathering his remaining energy for the powerful conclusion. Society may judge us. History may forget us. But the gods will know that what flows here is not merely the water of the river, but the pure current of devotion that cannot exist in this imperfect world. He ended with the traditional pose, head bowed, right arm extended, left hand pressed against his heart. The theater remained absolutely silent. For one terrible moment, Takeo feared he had failed, that his performance had left the audience unmoved. Then came a sound he had not heard in 60 years. The soft, collective intake of breath that signaled deep emotion in a Japanese audience. It was followed by a single respectful clap, then another, then a wave of applause that grew until it seemed to shake the building. Takeo held his final pose for several seconds, as tradition dictated, then slowly straightened and faced the audience directly. The applause grew even louder. In the front row, Yumiko was weeping openly, her husband's arm around her shoulders. Beside them, his grandchildren were on their feet, applauding with unrestrained enthusiasm. Director Tanaka appeared at the edge of the stage, smiling broadly. It was time for Takeo to exit, but the audience's response showed no sign of diminishing. The director gestured for him to take a bow. Takeo bent forward from the waist as deeply as his aged body would allow. When he straightened, he saw that the entire audience was standing now. The ovation continued, washing over him in waves. After a second bow, he made his way slowly to stage left, where Naoki waited to help him navigate the small step down. Once in the wings, his legs began to tremble from a combination of exertion and emotional release. "You were magnificent," Naoki whispered, supporting his elbow as they made their way toward the dressing room. In the narrow corridor, members of the production team lined up to bow as he passed. Koji Watanabe stood among them, his eyes shining with admiration. "A master class," he said simply. Inside the dressing room, Takeo sank gratefully onto a chair. His heart was racing, his breath coming in short gasps. Toshiro immediately began removing the elaborate makeup, working gently around Takeo's now trembling features. "Are you all right, Matsumoto-san?" he asked with concern. "Yes," Takeo managed. "Just overwhelmed." Director Tanaka entered, his face alight with excitement. "The audience won't stop applauding," he reported. "We've had to extend the intermission. Critics are already using words like historic and transcendent." He knelt beside Takeo's chair. "How do you feel?" Takeo considered the question. The trembling was subsiding. What remained was a curious lightness, as if some weight he had carried for decades had finally been set down. "Complete," he said finally. "I feel complete." After the makeup was removed and the heavy costume exchanged for comfortable clothes, Takeo was ready to meet his family. They gathered in a private reception room adjoining the main lobby, where Yumiko immediately enveloped him in a careful embrace. "Father," she whispered, "I've never seen anything like it. You were transformed." His grandson, now a university professor himself, shook his head in wonder. "I knew you were an actor once, grandfather, but I had no idea." He gestured helplessly. Unable to find adequate words, his granddaughter, who had flown in from Osaka for the performance, simply held his hand between both of hers, tears still streaking her makeup. "Well," Takeo said, smiling at their reactions, "it seems the old man can still surprise you." They laughed, the emotional tension breaking. For the next hour, the family celebrated together, sharing stories and accepting occasional visitors, theater staff, performers from the retrospective, even a few distinguished audience members who had been granted special access. Near the end of the evening, Director Tanaka approached with a small flat package wrapped in indigo cloth. "A token of our gratitude," he said, presenting it to Takeo with a formal bow. Unwrapping the cloth, Takeo found a wooden plaque engraved with his name and the date, commemorating his return to the Minami-za stage. It was a traditional honor given to distinguished performers. "We would also like to make a request," the director continued somewhat hesitantly. "There has been enormous interest in your performance tonight. Several universities and cultural preservation societies have asked if we might arrange a recording for educational purposes." Takeo blinked in surprise. "A recording?" "A professional filming of the monologue," Tanaka explained. "Not for commercial release, but for archives and educational institutions. Your technique represents a period of kabuki history that has almost vanished." Takeo glanced at his family. Yumiko nodded encouragingly. "When would this happen?" he asked. "We could arrange it next week once you've had time to rest," the director said. "Just you on the stage, a small crew, no pressure of a live audience." Takeo thought about it. The idea of preserving his performance, of contributing something to the art form that had shaped his youth, appealed to him deeply. "I would be honored," he said. Later that night, back in his apartment, Takeo sat alone with a cup of tea. His body ached pleasantly, the way it used to after a successful performance in his youth. His mind kept replaying moments from the evening, the hush of the audience, the feel of the spotlight, the release of speaking those lines with his whole heart. He had thought this performance would be closure, a final chapter to a story interrupted long ago. Instead, it felt like an opening, a new beginning even in the winter of his life. The next morning, his telephone rang early. It was Naoki, sounding apologetic for calling before 8 o'clock. "Forgive the intrusion, Matsumoto-san, but I thought you would want to know. Your performance is on the front page of the arts section in 3 newspapers. The Kyoto Cultural Affairs Office has called asking if you would consider a small lecture demonstration for theater students." Takeo laughed softly. At my age, becoming an overnight sensation seems rather ironic. Over the following weeks, Takeo's life took an unexpected turn. The recording session with the theater went smoothly, resulting in a document that would indeed be used in universities and conservatories. The lecture for students turned into a series of 3, with young performers hanging on his every word as he demonstrated traditional techniques and shared stories from the golden age of post-war kabuki. 2 months after his performance, a small but prestigious award arrived from the National Cultural Preservation Society, honoring his contribution to Japanese theatrical heritage. The ceremony was held at the Minamiza, with Takeo's ever-expanding circle of family, friends, and newfound admirers in attendance. On his 98th birthday, celebrated in a private room at his favorite restaurant, Takeo's great-granddaughter asked the question that many had wondered but few had voiced directly. "Great-grandfather," the 12-year-old said with characteristic directness, "why did you go back to the stage after so many years? Weren't you scared?" The room quieted, everyone curious about his answer. Takeo looked at the faces around him, 4 generations of his family, director Tanaka and Naoki, who had become friends, even Koji Watanabe, who had sought his mentorship for an upcoming role. "I was terrified," he admitted with a smile, "but I realized something important. Our lives don't move in straight lines. They circle back, offering second chances when we least expect them." He took a sip of sake, specially permitted by his doctor for the occasion. "I went back to complete something, but found instead a new beginning." He raised his cup in a toast, his hand steady and sure. "The lesson, I think, is simple. It is never too late to become who you might have been. Or perhaps," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "to remember who you already are." Around the table, cups and glasses rose in response, and in that moment, surrounded by love and newfound purpose, Takeo Matsumoto, paper seller, father, grandfather, and once again actor, felt younger than he had in 60 years.